If you're looking for proven ways to take your fundraising results to the next level, you're in the right place. Welcome to the Intentional Fundraiser Podcast, hosted by Tammy Zonker. Tammy has trained and led thousands of nonprofit organizations to collectively raise more than $500 million and is also recognized as one of America's top 20 fundraising experts. This is the podcast where Tammy equips and empowers amazing fundraising pros like you to transform your fundraising so you can transform the world. And now, let's hear from Tammy.
Today, I'm talking with the one, the only Mallory Erickson. If you know Mallory, if you've heard her speak at a conference or listened to her on a podcast, What the Fundraising, you know how passionate she is about helping fundraisers and nonprofit leaders. With a rich background in the sector, she initially found herself in fundraising by chance, like so many of us have. And she was feeling overwhelmed and disconnected from the very essence of her work. And I know some of you listening, you can relate to this. Her journey took a pivotal turn when she embraced practices rooted in behavioral science and design thinking, which reshaped her approach to fundraising and led to the creation of her signature program, the Power Partners Formula. Her unique framework combines science-based practices with executive coaching. And in fact, she has coached over 60,000 fundraisers, helping them shift their mindset from viewing fundraising as a chore to seeing it as more of an opportunity for meaningful connection and impact. Beyond her work as a coach, Mallory is a co-founder of Fundraising.ai, a collaborative for the responsible and beneficial use of artificial intelligence in fundraising, of which I am a proud member of the Global Advisory Council. And Mallory recently published a brilliant new book called What the Fundraising: Embracing and Enabling the People Behind the Purpose. And that's what we're here to talk about today. Mallory, welcome to the show.
Oh my gosh, Tammy, thank you so much. I'm so honored to be here to get to talk with you about it and for that amazing introduction. Thank you.
You're very welcome. And the honor is mine. All right, I'm just going to jump in. You write, and I'm paraphrasing a bit, but you write that we as a sector are plagued by a simultaneous decline in giving and the fundraiser crisis, right? There's a shortage of us. There's chronic stress, there's burnout, there's turnover. And clearly, these issues are not unrelated. So you tackle this head on in this amazing new book, What the Fundraising: Embracing and Enabling the People Behind the Purpose. And I haven't read a book this good in quite some time. Like, I've read a lot of good books, a lot of great books. And this is, I have to say, Mallory, this is top of the list right now for me. Talk to us about it.
Oh my gosh, I'm a little bit speechless that you just said that. It means so much to me because I think you and I both know a number of people who have written books, and I feel like my perception was always that it was easy for them, and who knows if that was true or not, but this was like very hard for me. And it's so hard when you're in the middle of doing something really hard to know if you're doing it in a way that other people are really going to be able to hear what you're trying to say. I wrote it mostly after having my second daughter, which was really nice for this sort of like postpartum quiet bubble where I wasn't being sort of exposed to new research and I could just sort of like sit with my beliefs and thoughts and argument around all these things. But it also meant that nobody in our sector had read it or even parts of it. And so putting it out into the world and then getting to hear things like that from you, it just means so much to me. And I'm so happy to hear it. You know, I think like you, I have always wanted, and like you coach around this and teach around this, that meaningful relationships, real relationships are what actually transform fundraising and transform fundraisers. I think I felt when I was being tasked with that, this disconnect between that advice and what I felt like I could do. And at the time, I didn't really understand why. And I was sort of like, I have too many things on my plate. My to-do list is too long, right? Like I had all these reasons for why I wasn't fundraising in a way that sort of prioritized real connected relationships. And then once I started to understand more about my own, like the relationship between my brain and body and fundraising, and it sort of set me on this quest to like uncover what happens inside of us when we're doing any vulnerable thing, right? But fundraising being one very clear example of that. And honestly, if people were to go back to what the fundraising episodes and look at videos, there are just so many videos with like my mouth completely like agape as a scientist, like tells some information. And I'm just like, wait, what? So if this is true, then does that mean this and this? And I think I just slowly started to understand, thanks to the research and wisdom and like expertise of, so many different like neuroscientists, psychologists, behavioral scientists. I started to really understand that how we feel and what we do are really, really deeply connected. And if we want to build connected, meaningful relationships, we can't be in a chronic stress state, because then that part of our brain that does those things is turned off and we're in survival mode, and we are, just prioritizing essentially like not dying and energy consumption. And so it started to like get me to this point of being like, wait, so are we asking fundraisers to do this sort of impossible thing, that the advice that we're giving them and the system that they're in to take that advice are really at odds with each other? And part of that, like, belief or curiosity started to get pushed forward because of some of the results that I was seeing in Power Partners. Not just that people were raising more money or feeling better raising more money, but when I started to look at, I'd get like an email from somebody that would be like, oh, I just moved my organization from 200,000 to 700,000, or we just got our first $1 million thing, or I just raised my first $45,000. I started to look at what they had done inside the program in terms of the strategy and just to sort of learn a little bit more about them. And I kept finding time after time that a lot of the people had only done the executive coaching piece of the program, and then started to see these tremendous results. And I was like, maybe there's something here, like something that I haven't gone deep enough around. And so what is sort of like beyond just some of the mindset stuff we typically talk about, what happens when we really like unearth the truth about our experiences? And I sort of bear all of that in the book, both my own realizations as a fundraiser and things I got wrong and did wrong, and, have my own embarrassment around, but felt like I really needed to say it so that other people could know they weren't alone. And then tried to put the pieces together around like, so how do we deal with this?
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. And when you speak about the incongruence between feelings and beliefs and actions, and when those are at odds, like I have a flood of memories coming back as a frontline fundraiser, and I'm sure our listeners do too. When our feelings, our beliefs, and our actions are out of alignment, it is very stressful and it gets
Mhm.
us out of alignment. In the book, you introduce this concept of alignment fundraising. And I'd love for you to talk about it in general, but very specifically, when you spoke about it, you talked about it in terms of how fundraisers who are pressured into a money first transactional mindset, like where are the numbers? Where are you at your goal? We've got a gap of this much to close this month. It's almost year end. Like me just rattling that off is spiking the blood pressure of our listeners right now. Right. But and
Mhm.
when in truth, yes, we want to hit those goals because we know that it fuels the mission, it impacts lives, but we also have a authentic concern and respect and love for our supporters. And so sometimes we're at a point where we are kind of forced in a transactional mindset when we really want to build long-term relationships, which we know yields a far greater return on investment. Talk to us about that in general, and then specifically, how do we navigate that tug, that push and pull between transactions and getting the numbers in and really taking care of our supporters?
I say in the book, like, I am not the first person, the only person to talk about alignment at all. Alignment is talked about a lot in our sector. Alignment, fundraising, and sort of naming that is my effort in saying alignment is an important part of fundraising, but to really stay in alignment requires a personal alignment, like skills around personal alignment and tools to stay in personal alignment. as well as skills and tools and strategy around how you identify alignment with funders, cultivate that alignment with funders, build relationships rooted in alignment. And to your point before, I think a lot of fundraisers would say, and I probably would have said this too, like, yes, I want to focus on alignment, but do you focus on alignment once the scarcity beliefs come back in? Do you focus on alignment once the stigma around talking about money is present? Do you focus, right? And so there are all these things about both the act of fundraising. And I don't say this to say like the only way to fundraise is to be in a chronic stress state. But I think one of the things that was really interesting to me in my research was identifying these things that are normal in fundraising that lead to chronic stress. So rejection and uncertainty, isolation, right? Power dynamics, pressure. So all of these things, we talk a lot about burnout in our sector related to overwork. And I'm not saying we shouldn't be setting better boundaries around our work. But what I kept finding, and this was true for me too at a certain point, was like people would reduce their hours of work and they would be like, I'm not overworking anymore, but they were still burnt out. And I was like, okay, it's not just about time. Like there's got to be these things that we're experiencing. And so what does it mean that all those things lead to chronic stress? Does it mean that fundraisers are bound to be stressed? No, but we need tools then to deal with that stress and to deal with the things that make that decline from discomfort to dysregulation to chronic stress to burnout. So for me, the alignment, like fundraising piece was like, yes, alignment as a strategy with funders is really important. But if you're going to really look for alignment as an intention, right, to really find alignment instead of the intention just being about money, because that's the other thing, like your piece around sort of that feeling of incongruency. I feel like there are all these times we say, here's what I'm looking for, but like inside our body, our fear and pressure is around the money. And so it just doesn't feel aligned, right? And so what does it look like then to have our intention be around alignment? How would we measure success differently if we were looking for alignment? How would we measure campaigns or emails or relationships differently if our intention was really around alignment as opposed to just money? And that requires like the thing that is not in the book, right? And that I think is probably like next, and somebody who has more of an organizational science background hopefully will write this, is like, how do we take these concepts and apply them to team culture and KPIs and right? Because it's like, how do we then measure for these things? I have tools on like the individual level, but there's a lot that could go into how do we think about this? Because to your point, if at the end of the day, your boss is coming to you and just being like, okay, like, where's so and so? Then, best laid plans, we're back to just focusing on the money. Or if you have a really bad experience with a donor who treats you really poorly, and at the end of the day, or there's even, God forbid, worse, but then you go back to your leadership and you're like, hey, this thing happened. And we just move that donor around or give that to another person and we make it all okay. We're continuing to signal that it's a money above all else. And then it's hard to make that type of fundraising feel good.
Totally agree. I am recalling an experience I had as a frontline fundraiser when it was in the space of the power dynamics and kind of white saviorism, and a conversation came up where there was clearly a misunderstanding on the donor's perspective of who
Mm,
we were serving. And rather than just smile and fawn and, I
mm,
really felt compelled, like, I need to push back. I need to disrupt this stereotype and this misconception
mm,
because, yes, I might risk losing a gift or the donor altogether. But I think every time you take a stand in alignment, in truth, you attract more people who are in alignment with you. And those are tough, tough decision points, and we have to make them kind of in the moment. And
mm-hmm.
and I think, I've been fundraising for nearly 30 years. At that point, about 25 years for sure. Looking back, I wonder if I were much younger in my career, if I would have had the strength and the courage to push back, to course correct, to be in alignment with my values and what I stood for and what our organization does. And I know our listeners, you, me, we all experience that repeatedly throughout our careers. And if our listeners haven't, you will. And so I love your point about really being clear on your alignment. Like, what are your values? What are your beliefs? Why are you doing this? And in that moment of stress, whether it's a donor experience or whether it's a manager or leader asking about numbers, like that's when push comes to shove and we really have to fall back on those values.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And it's so hard. Like, right? Like, I think you might have done it when you were younger, but I didn't. Like, I had so many conversations where I don't even think in the moment I fully saw it, right? I was just like in people pleasing mode or in like tunnel vision around like, Mallory, you are so close, like, get it done, right? Or needing to appease my board and just have them get off my back about something. And so I was like, just show this win, right? And then they'll leave you alone about X, Y, and Z. Like, and so just to say, like, there's for anyone listening who is realizing maybe that they had one of those moments where they weren't that brave, that that is really normal. And I think to your point, Tammy, like these things, they, first of all, they take time to change inside of us. They happen through series of 1-degree shifts. Sometimes those happen at the beginning with coming back after a donor meeting and sending an email and being like, hey, I've thought more about this piece that we talked about, and I want to make sure something is clarified, or right. And so you maybe it will take you a while to in the moment be like, oh, here's an example of like where I should push back, because our stress state just does so many things to jumble our brain. And so if we're in the moment, it can be so hard. But I think that's amazing. And I wish I had been that brave earlier in my career and heard examples. Like, I'm so glad you said that, because I think I also had never listened to somebody talk about how they had done it. I only listened to people talk about how they had gotten the money.
Yeah. So you talk about rejection and isolation and the power dynamics and all those pressures. You also talk about and really aim to dismantle some other common fundraising myths and misconceptions that lead to ineffective fundraising strategies, like you mentioned shiny object syndrome, perfectionism, discomfort. Talk us through some of those other pesky little distractors that can really disempower us.
I think one of the things that I realized, I did a podcast interview with somebody who was talking about something called the polyvagal theory, which is basically our like nervous system's response. And he was giving this example of thinking about our nervous system as different sort of manifestations of water. So in our grounded state, we are running water. When we're in our fight or flight stress state, we're air, right? We're steam. And then when we're in freeze, we're ice. And water in each of those states doesn't actually know about itself in the other state. And it doesn't necessarily know how to bring itself back to that other state without sort of awareness that it could be something else. And one of the things that happened on our conversations, we started to talk about the types of strategies in our current society that we use to handle steam, for example. So we're in fight or flight. And he said something on the podcast like, most of the strategies we use to handle those steam moments actually just create more steam. And
Mm.
all of a sudden I was like, oh my gosh. So shiny object syndrome is a nervous system response. We are bouncing from thing to thing, trying to settle our fight or flight reflex. Our anxiety is the flight, right? We want to get out of our anxiety. So when we pick something and we're like, oh, I'm going to do this thing, we are fleeing the anxiety of uncertainty. And so we are bouncing to one thing because it soothes this uncertainty that feels really uncomfortable that we don't want to sit in. And it feels better to be doing something, even if that doing is maybe not directly related to some of the outcomes we're trying to see, but it
Yeah.
feels better in that moment. And one of the things that I talk about on the Power Partners webinar is like, and this happens a lot in Power Partners, is that people have to deal with the discomfort of not doing as much, because the goal is not to reach out to every single person you know who's ever given to a nonprofit ever, right? And so part of identifying alignment is also recognizing who is not aligned, that you are not actually doing as much outreach as you were before because you're being really specific and targeted and intentional and all of those things. And perfectionism is another example of a stress response. It is like, not only do these things hold us back, but to sort of re-emphasize that they're coming from a place that is in stress. Like, we're never going to come up with our best fundraising strategies when we're in a stress state. And shiny object syndrome is one of those states. Perfectionism is another one of those states. Perfection is not real. It is an illusion. And so our striving for perfectionism is about protection from the perception that we aren't good enough or perfect enough, right? Perfectionism is often a delay tactic. Oh, I'll be ready to send this impact report out once we've reviewed it for the 32nd time, right? It helps us sort of kick the can a little bit. And excellence and perfection are not the same thing, because perfection is seeking an impossible, but it feels reassuring to us. It feels like we have control over something that we really don't have control over, but it helps sort of reduce that anxiety. And so then when we don't sort of have awareness around these pieces, back to your original question, then these strategies come out of that stress state that actually just really increase our stress. And you brought up discomfort, which I think is a really interesting one to talk about, because this was one of the hardest things in the book to write about, that not all discomfort is created equal, right? Sometimes discomfort is a sign. Like, I bet you were really uncomfortable in that meeting where you were brave, where you were like,
Yes,
right?
absolutely.
But that's good discomfort. Like, that's discomfort to stay in alignment, right? Despite what somebody might think about you in a moment. But then there's also discomfort of that misalignment, or that like disingenuous, like the incongruencies, right? There's discomfort around the incongruencies. And so part of what we want to understand with discomfort is like, where is the discomfort coming from? Is it because we are doing something transactional that we're like, we really don't want to do, but I feel like I'm supposed to do it? Or is the discomfort because I'm trying to rewrite some of the patterns around how I people please in these moments, and I'm going to sit in my discomfort? And at the end of the day, and like, this is really what executive coaching teaches us, all of that is about consciousness, right? It's not really about discomfort being good or bad. It's more about, are we conscious of the discomfort? Are we curious about where it's coming from? Do we then, once we sort of get that curiosity, make intentional and conscious choices about whether we want to sit in it or we want to make a change? So that was sort of a long answer to your question, but I hope I got
Oh
it.
my gosh. I think my life makes sense now. And B, I can see why you are such a successful coach, because I feel like you just took me to like fundraising therapy. I mean, you're right. It is so much of it is about self-awareness. And so much of the training we receive is about being aware of external
Mhm.
volunteers, donors, probable donors, our board members. The self-awareness is equally, if not more important, because it really does equip us to be better in our and more intentional and more conscious about our behaviors, our actions, and making certain that we are in alignment. Knowing what alignment means for us is so
Mhm.
crucial to the process. And knowing what's not, what's out of alignment. That in of itself would be a very powerful exercise, and not a one time. I'm sure it's iterative, right?
Mhm.
It's an ongoing process.
Mhm.
Amazing. Thank you. Thank you for that.
I love what you said about, so much of what we're trained to do is think about other people, because I think that is also a really important point, that so many people in fundraising roles have strong helper energy. If you read the book, you'll know level 4. We are very empathetic people. We may be highly sensitive, a lot of us. And so our normal operating is to be attentive to everybody else's experience. And when that is paired without an awareness of our own experience, then that's how we sort of walk ourselves into a lot of these incongruencies, because then all of a sudden we're like 4 steps in and we're like, something about this feels really wrong, but I don't know where that started.
Yes. And the train has left the station. What do I
Right.
do? I
Mhm.
guess I'm just going to go with it. So, how can we as nonprofit fundraisers, as leaders, overcome our personal resistance, overcome the discomfort, overcome that love hate relationship with fundraising? Like, I love my job and I don't want to pick up the phone. I love my
Mhm.
job. I don't want to do one on one asks. I love my job.
Mhm.
I can't be quiet and let the donor think after I've made a face to face ask. You know the things, all those things. Help us get more uncomfortable so that we can be
Mm.
more confident and just give our supporters and ourselves a better experience of this work.
I think for me, one of the biggest pieces to this are tools that help us manage discomfort, right? So, one piece, actually, maybe even before we go there, is like recognizing that all of those fears are really normal, right? That resistance to picking up the phone, that the fear around, I mean, I talk about in the book, like I thought I was, a bad fundraiser for so long because I was like, there's no way that good fundraisers want to throw up before donor meetings, right? I just had this perception that the good fundraisers, they like always felt good. And this was a sign that I was bad and didn't know what I was doing and all of those things. And so I think one piece is just sort of normalizing that resistance to picking up the phone, that fear of the meeting, the inability to, I mean, I have ADHD, like the amount of times I've jumped in with caveats after asking for a gift amount, I mean, are endless, right? So part of it is recognizing that those feelings, because without consciousness, what happens is our feelings come in and we let those feelings tell the story. So we're like, oh, I don't want to pick up the phone. It's because I'm not ready, right? And our brain, remember, it's our survival brain. So it's just like, I'm saying that to listeners, the goal is to get you to not take action. The goal of your survival brain is like play dead, conserve as much energy as possible, don't move, right? And so that is the goal of that part of our brain, which is just not adapted to our current everyday life. And so what happens a lot of times is we get this discomfort or this fear, and our brain tells our body to stop. But we don't want to stop, right? But the way it tells us to stop is it doesn't say you're scared, don't do this. It says that person's going to be mad at you for reaching out again. So and so's not going to like you because of X. You're not ready to do that because you haven't done this. As soon as you take that other webinar, you'll be ready for. Our brain is so tricky, and it just plays all these narratives that are designed to stop us from taking action. And so the first piece is really just like awareness around how you feel and knowing that that's normal. And instead of trying to tough love yourself or say, oh gosh, Mallory, you've been doing this for 15 years, like suck it up already, just saying like, that makes sense. This is really vulnerable. This is scary. Like that makes sense. Validating, acknowledging and validating our emotions. And then, and this is what I talk a lot about in the book, recognizing the thought pattern that has crept up from your lizard brain, essentially, and giving yourself the option and opportunity and curiosity to rewrite some of those beliefs and narratives so that you can feel better and then ultimately take action. But really, like if people took away just one thing, the very first piece would just be awareness, like awareness of how they feel and awareness of some of those narratives that aren't just adopted as truth. That, like, oh, maybe it's not about me not being ready. Maybe that is just my fear response. Or maybe it's not about that donor not liking me. I'm just nervous that they won't like me as much as I want them to. And so I just feel like that gives people such a good place to even just take the actions that they're currently not taking, right? It's like before we talk about your whole new fundraising strategy, probably everybody who's listening to this has things on their to-do list that have been there for a little while, that are directly related to their fundraising results, that have been really hard to move off their to-do list. And my guess would be that a good portion of those, especially the ones that are actually only 5-minute tasks, are because of this fear. And so the first piece is to like move away those pieces, either by bringing awareness into your brain and using some different cognitive tools, or coming into your body and using somatic tools to downregulate your nervous system.
Amazing. As you describe that, I'm just reflecting that often, at least in my world, often I will spend more time fretting, procrastinating, coming up with all the reasons why, for myself, than it actually take. If I could have redirected half that time, the thing would have been done. And to your point, taking the time to really reflect on what is going on inwardly, it's just fear. And to give ourselves a little grace and maybe a little self pep talk. I think that that's missing. We are so busy, we're moving so fast, or create the illusion that we're moving so fast that it allows us to not do the deep work.
Mhm.
Now, someone like you can draw those insights out, right? Through conversation, through coaching. So, talk a little bit about what role executive coaching plays in improving fundraising outcomes for fundraisers and for organizations.
So, one of the big differences between coaching and consulting, and I sort of like toe the line, right? So, a lot of times in my calls with clients, I'll say, are you okay with me stepping out a coach role here and going into sort of consulting, brainstorming partners? But consulting is a lot more about helping people or giving people the answers to things, right? Helping to co create that strategy using your expertise in that area to help guide an organization forward. Coaching is really rooted in the belief that people have the answers inside of themselves, or a lot of the answers inside of themselves. And your role as a coach is to hold that space for people to self discover the answer. And talk about discomfort is like one of the biggest things about getting coach certified was like learning how to sit in your discomfort of just wanting to fix it for somebody or solve it for somebody. And I think this is something, I'm sure you do this in your work, Tammy, because you are a truth teller, right? Is like, I feel like sometimes in our industry, and this, goes into consultants too. We want to make the client happy. We want like the session to end and everybody to feel great. And so maybe we don't tell them the hard truth about what's happening. And so coaching is really about, not taking things at face value, getting really curious with things. And to your point about time, that was something I started to see really early. I would have clients come back the week before we had given them things that they needed to do. They hadn't done them. And they were like, I didn't have time. I had so many things to do. Right. And maybe if I had just been in consultant role, I would have been like, okay, well, no problem. But next week, let's put them back on the to-do list. But in the coach role, it was like, okay, tell me a little bit about what you mean by you didn't have time. What were some of the other things that end up getting prioritized? Tell me a little bit about that decision making for you around X, Y, and Z. And that exploration, that curious exploration kept leading us to, okay, it wasn't about time, it was about fear. And so that, especially if you haven't sort of thought about how you feel before around fundraising, that takes some steps, right, to get there and be like, actually, maybe I felt that in my body. Maybe that was in my belly. Maybe I heard this thing in my head and I took it to, mean X, Y, and Z. And so I think we live in a very binary world these days, and we are not great at nuance at the moment. And I think part of that is also because our whole society is like in a higher state of overwhelm. And so being in a more stressed state, there just is less ability to sort of manage discomfort and the gray. But I think what that means is like we have to start to think more about curiosity, like how we can get curious, because otherwise we just ultimately do end up kind of repeating the same patterns. And I think coaching is a really great tool, executive coaching with somebody who's, certified as an executive coach, but there's lots of, self-coaching books. And I have a lot of self-coaching practices in What the Fundraising too, that are just starting to get curious inside of yourself if you can't afford or don't have an executive coach yourself.
Yeah. Mallory, you mentioned curiosity. From the moment we started talking and throughout our conversation today. It really is an important characteristic for great fundraisers and just people in life, right? Talk to me about how you came to this realization. Have you always been curious and valued that, or has this been an evolution of your appreciation around curiosity?
I think I have always been a sort of innately curious person. When I got executive coach certified, though, I started to learn more about, like in the book, for folks who maybe aren't familiar with the different concepts, in the book, I talk about this idea of catabolic energy and anabolic energy, these two different ways we show up. And catabolic energy is a lot more sort of binary, tunnel vision. Everything is right or wrong. It's filled with a lot of judgment. It creates a lot of dread and resistance inside of us. Anabolic energy is more fueling, expansive, regenerative, creative, connected energy. And it's a spectrum. In the book, I talk about these 7 levels. This is all through IPEC and where I got coach certified. And I've just adapted it to fundraisers. But these are not my frameworks. But in that training, I started to become really aware of the role curiosity can play in pulling us out of catabolic energy. That actually, when we feel more curious, all of a sudden there's like space, right? Like before, you were talking a little bit about your own rumination, right? And so often when we're ruminating, what's happening in our brain is right and wrong, right? If I do this, then I do this, or I can only do this and I can only do that. And we ping pong like in that state. And it sucks our energy, our time, all of those things. And what I started to learn through my coach training was the way in which curiosity creates options that immediately, whether or not you take any of those options, immediately starts to feel more expansive. I was doing a webinar on AI stuff the other day, and I said uncommon ways to use AI. And one of them was like, if you're finding yourself in a position where you hear in your head, we don't have the donors to reach X goal, or there's no way we're going to be able to do blank, blank, right? And you're hearing that very definitive judgment, is like ask a generative AI tool to create 10 scenarios of how you could go from X to Z. Here are the constraints, here are the problems, here are all the reasons you think you shouldn't be able to do it, but have generative AI give you 10 ways you could. And even just seeing that, those potentials start to kind of pull us out of that really judgment heavy tunnel vision that often makes us feel really trapped. I think curiosity just feels so good, like in our bodies, you know?
Yeah.
And there's a lot of science around like wonder being good for our nervous system. Dr. Britt Frank just came out with a study. I haven't read the whole thing around the relationship, like when we can't be empathetic, like because empathy can really tax us. And not that empathy isn't important, but sometimes we can hit burnout because we've been sort of to what you and I have been talking about before, like prioritizing everybody else. And so she talks about in this article, like swapping curiosity for empathy when you feel like you have sort of reached that mix. And so there's a lot of cool, interesting science around curiosity too. So it was sort of a combo of my personal experience, the coach training, and then just some of these amazing therapists.
Yeah, I love it. I hear 2 things. I hear from a lot of nonprofits, like, we're a small nonprofit. We have limited resources. How do we implement strategies like the strategies that you talk about in what the fundraising? I also work with large universities and healthcare systems. So, like, yeah, there's a lot of us, but we're stretched so thin. It's like mission envy in some ways, right? We're too small, we're too big. The bottom line is we're all trying to do so much with often what feels like so little, right? Again, when we end this call, I'm going to really spend some reflective time about my relationship to time, because as you said, it's not just about the time in most cases, right? It's the fear, it's the whatever behind the time. But all that to say, what are your best suggestions for how to implement these strategies inside organizations that feel like they're too small or they're too strapped or they're too lean?
Well, I think you already did this for them, Tammy, in certain ways, because I think your point about time, I mean, this comes up all the time, right? We don't have the capacity for X. We don't have enough time to do blank. And I'm not saying that nonprofits are not under resourced. And I say multiple times in the book, there's no amount of inner work that will make up for a toxic workplace, for example. However, the individual and inner work increases our capacity for dealing with it. And while, yes, this is like a place where nuance is really important. While, yes, we all have too many things on our to-do list, we also all spend too much time in rumination. So let's just take everything else out of the equation for a second. If you could just stop second guessing yourself and doubting yourself and going back and forth on decisions, what amount of time would that free up? Does it solve everything? No, but does it give you capacity to solve the next thing? And so I think that is really where I would have people sort of focus, is like, where is resistance, either on an individual level or collective level, getting in the way of us being able to take action? Taking action actually reduces fear. So one of the ways, like, in our body to get out of our stress state is to. So the very first thing is to sort of recognize, okay, what do we sort of already have on our plate? What's our plan for the rest of the year? Where are we stuck? Like, where are the resistance points? Are those resistance points coming because of a false narrative inside our head? Are they coming because we actually just haven't even acknowledged that it is a resistance point because we keep acting like it should be easy, and just sort of like removing the barriers, getting curious about where that barrier came from in the first place, getting curious about how you could overcome that barrier. In the book, I talk about 4 primary types of inner blocks that sort of get in our way and how we overcome each of them separately, from the gremlin to assumptions, interpretations, limiting beliefs. They all have slightly different strategies, but they're all rooted in curiosity. So I would say, like, no matter what size your team is, if all volunteers, if you're the only paid staff member, if you have everybody's experiencing resistance. So it's about, like, just taking a step back, looking at where those points of resistance live, those sort of like hot spots, and figuring out actually what can be removed in order to enable it, instead of what do you need to add in? Like, what can be removed? And usually that's a inaccurate thought, or a way in which we're just being really mean to ourselves, or we're not acknowledging our feelings. And I'll just say one other like quick thing about this, which is, you brought up phone calls before and people feeling resistant to phone calls. I did not know this until recently, but politicians, when they're fundraising, and you probably know this, they have people sit next to them during their phone calls. They're called call times. And the person's only job is to literally sit next to the politician and make sure that they make those phone calls. And so what a testament to the fact that fundraising phone calls are scary, that this whole, system is set up so that somebody literally physically sits next to them. But then in our industry, we're like, why can't I just make these phone calls? And we just are so hard on ourselves, instead of being like, actually, those phone calls are scary.
They are hard. They are scary.
And that's okay. It doesn't mean we don't do them. It doesn't mean we don't figure out. So, like, if you were going to get curious about 2 things, it's like, where is the resistance? And if the resistance is this thing doesn't feel aligned, then the question is, how can I do this with 10% more alignment or 1% more alignment? It's not about throwing everything out right away. It's about starting to reorient ourselves towards our North Star in ways that feel good and in ways that feel manageable.
My friends, I believe this was our mic drop moment. I mean, so simple, but so deeply rooted in truth. Just powerful. Thank you. All right. I cannot let you go without asking you to unpack something. You write about growing your fundraising by 10 times in 6 months when you were a frontline fundraiser. Can you share some of those key strategies that led to that remarkable growth?
Yeah. So the biggest one was figuring out what not to do. So when I was leading this organization, there was so much pressure on me to build a foundation pipeline, a corporate partner pipeline, and an individual pipeline at the same time. And I was so scattered, running between those 3 things, doing none of them very well. But I had this voice, like, diversify the funding, Mallory, diversify the funding. Everybody needs an individual giving program, right? Sort of like all the things we're taught. And then once I started to do this work and I started to really understand more about alignment and understand more of what are different types of funders looking for and who are we as an organization and how do we align with each of those types of funders and sort of their lens through a partnership, I realized that we actually didn't have the assets at the time for a foundation program. And we didn't have the infrastructure for an individual giving program right then and there. But what we did have in droves was corporate partner opportunities that were highly valuable and positioned very well in the market and had a lot of momentum around it. And I was like, okay, what if I reimagined corporate partnerships? And I didn't just think about, okay, what does it look like to diversify within that type of funding? So not only did I go and, try to move somebody who had been a $100,000 funder to $400,000, I did those things too. But I took us, I think, from 8 corporate sponsors to something like 43. And I thought about scale. I thought about packaging things. I thought about where can we bring in as many sponsors as we want versus where is this really about sort of like a single well-positioned sponsor. And I just went very deep around the corporate partnership program. It helped me really optimize my time, my outreach, my conversations. I was like in the lens of the corporate partner at all times. That's always what was top of mind. I wasn't distracted. My actions were clear. My dates were clear. Like that's one of the things, this so hard about a fundraising calendar, right? Is like if you're managing an event calendar at the same time as a campaign calendar. And I was one person. And so I was like, okay, I have to streamline. Now, does it mean that we won't build these other things later? No, but I need to focus on this to build enough capacity to then solve for the things I don't have, which was the data for foundations or the infrastructure for individual giving. That's how I did it. I just like laser focused and I said no to everything else. And I pushed back on the board and I said, give me 6 months. Give me 6 months. Like I know everybody is really uncomfortable with this idea of me not spray firing every opportunity everywhere. I was like, give me 6 to see if I can do this, just focusing. And they did. And it really was tremendous.
Amazing. And I'm sure that program became more sustainable because of the depth and the infrastructure and the systems that were created as a result of that laser focus.
Yes.
Love that.
And it had a short term, corporate partners differently than individual giving and foundation have a different timeline around length, right? It's like if you can show value quickly, then it can still be relationship based, but the way in which you're talking about things and the time horizon that you have to really implement things is a little bit shorter. So do I think you could do that with individual giving in 6 months? Like probably not in that same way, right? Not without jeopardizing some of that long-term relationship. Whereas exactly to your point with corporate sponsors, it could deepen it because I was so committed to figuring how do we do this well in a way that feels really good to everybody. It's on a short time horizon, but then the goal is that we're learning from this, we're deepening, we're figuring out what's next.
So good. Alignment.
Yeah.
Alignment.
Yeah.
All right. So Mallory, I can't believe we've been talking for almost an hour. We typically wrap the episodes with some rapid fire questions. So are you ready?
I'm ready.
All right. Mallory, what's the best fundraising advice you've ever heard?
I had a coach once who said, make the ask over soup. And it was this idea for meetings that I was having with donors that I wouldn't spend the whole meeting figuring out when I would talk about money. But I would say, like, I'm so excited for us to spend this time together today to get to talk about all the things based on what I sent my email around. Would love to get like a businessy thing out of the way at the beginning. Can we talk about this first and then go into? And it just like freed up my energy. And so make the ask over soup. Luco.
I love that. That is a new one and I like it. What book do you recommend to our audience and why?
One of the books that totally changed my life was Seth Godin's Purple Cow, which is an older, small, quick read of his. But that really started to have me thinking about kind of community and market and language and marketing. And now he has, I mean, I don't know how you pick at this point. That was my first introduction to him. But that I love that. And then This is Marketing, his book. I feel like you could cross off the word marketing and write fundraising, and you would have so many like nuggets of wisdom.
Yeah. Yeah. What are the 3 most important traits you think a successful fundraiser must possess?
Curiosity,
I knew it.
courage,
Mm.
and self-compassion.
I love that. What's your favorite fundraising application or tool?
Ooh, that is really hard. And I feel like I could get my feet held to the fire for this one. But I will say I have really loved using generative AI tools like ChatGPT, Perplexity, Claude as thought partners in fundraising and to really push my thinking and creativity and curiosity forward.
Very good. What's your favorite conference and why?
My gosh, this is also so hard. Okay, I have to go with the Fundraising AI conference, but I'm going to attribute that to Nathan Chappelle and really grateful to Community Boost for that too. But I feel like as a non-tech person, I get to learn so much at that conference about the way to incorporate technology and particularly AI into our fundraising. So I feel really grateful to be a learner at that event.
I agree. It was spectacular. And you're very modest because you are actually co-founder of fundraising.ai along with Nathan and doing such important work. Such important work. So thank you for that. All right. Last official question. Knowing what you know now about fundraising, what advice would you give your younger self, Mallory?
I would tell her that she's doing better than she thinks she is
Mm.
and to just keep coming home to herself at the end of the day and orienting her fundraising from there.
Powerful. It's been amazing chatting with you, Mallory. Thank you again for being here.
Thank you so much for having me and for this conversation and for everything you do to help fundraisers be in alignment and feeling good and confident and courageous in their roles. I'm so grateful.
As I am grateful to you as well. To learn more about Mallory Erickson, her new book, What the Fundraising, Embracing and Enabling the People Behind the Purpose, her podcast, What the Fundraising, or Power Partners Formula, or even fundraising.ai, check out the links in the show notes. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Intentional Fundraiser podcast. Keep on transforming your fundraising so you can transform the world. The Intentional Fundraiser podcast is a Fundraising Transformed original. It's hosted by me, Tammy Zonker, founder and president of Fundraising Transformed, where we help equip and empower fundraisers, nonprofit leaders, and board members to transform their fundraising so they can transform the world. Visit fundraisingtransform.com/podcast to subscribe to this podcast and subscribe to my newsletter to get fundraising lessons, tools, and helpful resources delivered straight to your inbox each month. If you want my help with taking your fundraising to the next level, become a member of my Fundraising Transformers community as a growth member and join me live each month where I'll teach you the same strategies I use to lead, train, and coach thousands of nonprofits, social service organizations, healthcare foundations, private schools, colleges, and universities to collectively raise more than $500 million, including a single gift of $27.1 million. As a member, you can participate in my Ask Me Anything sessions every month and get answers to your burning questions. Chat with other growth members inside our private and safe online community about what you're working on, struggling with, and share lessons learned. And get instant access to my growing library of on-demand self-paced training classes. New content is added every single month. Learn more about becoming a member at fundraisingtransform.com/growth. Talk soon.